Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark, and we are in Ruth chapter 1. We're continuing our study in verse 20 this lesson, but before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, as we continue in verse 20, it says here, And she said unto them, Call me not Naomi, call me Mara. And we said last lesson that people have a tendency, especially Christians, have a tendency to wear name tags of their sin or of their profession. And as a Christian, we don't go around saying, Call me murder, or call me adulterer, or call me liar, or call me thief, because that's what I am, right? No, as a Christian, we name ourselves according to what God says about us, that we are the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus. Call me more than a conqueror. Don't call me sinner. Call me seated in heavenly places in Christ Jesus. All right? Or they wear the profession around their neck. Call me plumber, right? Call me architect, because that's what I do. Call me builder, because that's who I am. I'm a builder. No, you're not a builder. You're a Christian. You are God. You are God's son. You are God's king. You are God's queen. That's what you are. You're not a builder. That's what you do. You do build. You do plumbing, but that's not who you are. Who you are is what God says you are. That you're his son. You're his daughter. Now, so she says here, Call me not Naomi, call me Mara. Why? For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Now, some people see the workings of God in their life as being bitter. What God, through his love and kindness, is doing is turned against him and is seen as bitterness. So people see the workings of God in their life and they don't like it. And they turn it against God and they say, God, you're awful bitter. Right? You're being very bitter towards me. Naomi viewed God's working as judgment and not as love. But sometimes God's love can look like bitterness. All of God's workings in our life proceed from his love, even his chastenings. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 6, it says what? Whom the Lord loves, he chastens, right? It doesn't say whom the Lord hates. It doesn't say whom the Lord is disgusted with or whom the Lord wants to get revenge on. No, it says whom the Lord loves. Whom the Lord what? Loves, he chastens. We must determine in our mind that we will view everything from God as coming from his love. Not his anger, not his hatred, not his retribution. Unless, of course, you're living in sin or you're living in rebellion against God, then God is going to chasten us and he's going to try to bring us back, right? In reality, God was very loving to Naomi, but she would not realize this for a few months yet. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17, the Bible calls it a light affliction, which is only for a moment, right? Paul said this light affliction, these things that I'm going through, they're light and they're only for a moment. In 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 7, it says the trial of your faith. God, we look at the trials of our faith and we call it bitterness. God is angry, or we're questioning God. We're questioning our own life. Why is God against me? May have not anything to do with God being against you. He's more than likely he's for you, and he wants to bless you from this trial that you're going through. It's a light affliction, right? And it's only for a moment. You may say for a moment, it's been going on for a year or 2 years or for months now. Yeah, but compared to eternity, it's nothing. It's just a vapor. So she says, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. That was her view of how God dealt with her, but that wasn't the reality. She will find that out in a few months here. She said in verse 21, I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why then do you call me Naomi, seeing that the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? Now, full here for Naomi, she said, I went out full. Naomi's view of full was having a husband and sons, and maybe even including the possessions that she had when they left Bethlehem. The prodigal son also, he went out full, taking his share of the inheritance. If you view this with an earthly mind, you would agree with her. Yes, I'm coming from the human perspective. Yes, Naomi, you did go out full. Look at everything you had. You had a husband and 2 sons, and you went out and all the possessions that you had that you took with you to Moab, right? But spiritually, it was the opposite. Being full or being rich with this world's goods that will one day pass away, goods that are here today and gone the next day, is actually resulting in a poor soul if our heart is set on these temporal riches. God has actually filled her unknown emptiness in Moab by bringing Ruth to her. She didn't know she was empty. She went out, she thought she was leaving Bethlehem going into Moab full. In reality, she was leaving Bethlehem empty. Her heart was empty. Why? And many people, Christians have empty hearts. Why? Not because God's not there, he is there. But it's because of what they have set their heart upon. They're saved, they know God, they love God, but they've set their heart on things that are passing away, worldly treasures, riches, and things of this world. Sometimes God's answer for your situation is not worldly things, but it's a friend in Christ. And the emptiness that Ruth had when she lost her husband and her 2 sons, God was going to fill that emptiness with a person, not with possessions, not with more money, not with gold and silver, but with a person called Ruth. And God fills our empty hearts with our friend, Jesus Christ from heaven. So she says, I went out full, but the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Now, Naomi wasn't truly empty, except for the loss of her husband and her sons. She had provisions to make it back to Bethlehem. If anything was empty, it was her view of God's relationship with her. She thought she was empty, but she wasn't. God had provided Ruth for her. But really, if she truly was empty, she was empty because of her relationship with God. And many times we fail in the same area. Things go wrong and we view God differently. Wandering from God always results in emptiness. We have to understand that when we turn our hearts away from God, maybe God doesn't answer our prayer and we get angry and we turn our hearts away from God for a few weeks or a few months, whatever, maybe a few days. You have to understand when a person's heart is turned away from God, it always results in emptiness. Emptiness, emptiness, emptiness. Doesn't mean God leaves them, no. Doesn't mean they lost their salvation. No, no, no. It just means that their relationship to God is empty now. And then it says here, verse 21, why call ye me Naomi, seeing the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? So it says, seeing that the Lord has testified against me. Now, this phrase, seeing that the Lord has testified against me, was commonly used when one person was giving witness against another person in a court of law. Naomi believed that God was witnessing against her for sins that she committed, for a sin or sins that she had committed. So when she says here, God has dealt bitterly with me, why do you call me Naomi, seeing that the Lord has testified against me? She's trying to tell us that it's almost like God is testifying against her for sin or sins that she committed. All right, and like in a court of law. Now, some commentators think that the sin that she's referring to is the leaving of Bethlehem and going into Moab, leaving the promised land and going to Moab. But if this is true, then why not have her die with her husband and her children? I mean, if God truly was angry and testifying against her for her sins, how dare you? How dare you sin against me? How dare you leave Bethlehem, right? If that was true, then why not kill her in Moab also? We must remember her state of mind. Understand, in the context, we must remember her state of mind at this time. She was depressed and she was feeling, woe is me. That's how she was feeling. Woe is me, right? And when people feel like this, they imagine all kinds of things. Nowhere, listen, nowhere in the rest of this book, of the book of Ruth, does it say that God had to deal with a sin in her life. It doesn't say, nowhere does it say that God was dealing with some kind of sin in Naomi's life. It's very possible that this was only her opinion and not reality. And I think that's what it was. She says, God is testifying against me. Hey, Naomi, that's your opinion, but that's not reality. If God was dealing with some sin in her life, nowhere does Naomi ever confess that sin to God. It's not mentioned in the book of Ruth. Nowhere does she confess sin to God. So does what that mean? Does that mean that if she never confesses her sin to God, does that mean she was never forgiven? Never cleansed? And why did God continue to bless her throughout this book? So if sin was the issue, like she's trying to make it sound like, then why is God continuing to bless her over and over and over again? She's blind to the blessings of God. She lost her husband and her 2 sons, and now she's poor and without, and because of that, her whole mentality is changed against God. And she views now God's dealing with her as being bitter and not coming from love, not coming from grace and mercy. And this is what happens with people when things begin to go wrong. Their whole mentality of God changes. And now they see God as a hard taskmaster, as a God who maybe he does hate me. Maybe he's angry with me. Instead of seeing God as dealing with them out of love and compassion and grace and wanting to bless them, they see God as being some, hateful person and being against me, testifying in a court of law against some sin in my life. It doesn't seem to add up that God was against her. If anything, this whole book is that God is for her. And look, if you can come to your own conclusion on this also about what Naomi says about herself, that call me bitterness. She's in this, you have to understand the context. She's in a woe is me mentality. And when people get like that, they begin to change their viewpoint of who God is and how God treats people and how God approaches people out of love. They see chastisement as God hating them or God angry with them. Instead of seeing chastisement as God's love and care, they see it as bitterness. And then it says here, seeing that the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me. The Almighty has afflicted me. And it's believed that the affliction that she refers to may be the loss of her husband and her 2 sons. The Lord has testified against me, and the Lord has afflicted me. He didn't like it that we left Israel, and now he's taken my son and my two sons and my husband. Right? He's afflicted me. Verse 22, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. Now, barley harvest begins in April. Therefore, their journey from Moab back to Bethlehem, it didn't take them, they didn't get on a Greyhound bus and go there or fly, They had to walk. Maybe they rode a donkey, but the donkey isn't a car. So it took some time. So barley harvest is in April, and if they arrived in April, then it means they had to leave Moab sometime in late winter or early spring. That was when they left Moab, all right? And then it took them some time, several weeks, I guess, to travel with just Naomi and her daughter-in-law, and maybe they had a donkey or two to carry, possessions that they had, and it depends upon how they traveled. Did they travel south around the southern part of the Dead Sea and back up into Israel that way? Or did they go north up into the area of Reuben and then cross over the Jordan River? They had to get across the Jordan River somehow, right? And then go through Jericho back into Bethlehem. It just took time. So for them to arrive during barley season means that they left in April. They probably left right after the new year, who knows, February, March or whatever, when they left. All right. Until next lesson, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.